Welcome, everyone. It's been a very long day, a very exciting day. And it's great to finish the day with Raj, as we did yesterday. And obviously, there are so many links between the two films. But Raj, how did you feel to watch this film again now? And especially in the context of the farming conference, I mean, what kind of emotions did you feel?
Well, thank you, Laura. I mean, and thank y'all for having watched the film and suffered Hoover's technical difficulties and joined at the end of it. You must be exhausted. So here's the sort of bottom line for me is, watching it again, particularly after the sort of storms of the past year, and having spoken very recently to Anita, I'm struck by still, this is a relevant film, even though it was completed just as the pandemic was breaking. I still feel like there's something important here. This film took 10 years to make, and what you lose in immediacy, you gain in a certain kind of relevance, because a lot of this, the sort of challenges that Anita is facing are ones that are very real, very live, in the global South, and in the front lines of communities in the United States and the UK and around the world. I'm still feeling quite pleased with the. I'm very proud of the film. I'm proud of the work that everyone in the film who contributed to the film did. And most of all, I'm very happy that Soils, Food and Healthy Communities, and in particular Anita Chataya, are doing well despite the current sort of nightmares of COVID and of the lockdown and the recession.
Thank you, Raj. I can give you some of my reactions as well. I think it was a very brave film, because to touch on these inequalities is not an easy way of addressing issues. You can show at the same time all the similarities between small farmers. They share so many things, but at the same time, you didn't shy away from the fact that there are huge systemic inequalities between a country like Malawi and a country like the USA. And so I find that extremely brave. And is there anything you would like to comment around these issues? Daniel Cruz, for example, is asking us, could you please share some more of the learnings and reflections that the visit of Anita triggered for the farmers in the US she visited? So I add to this that issue of inequality. How did they feel? Did it make them feel bad to have to go back to a poor Malawi? Or, what can you remember from all of that?
Oh, it wasn't that Anita and Esther felt like, oh, yes, no, we've got to move here. We will fight tooth and nail to remain in the United States. Quite the contrary. I think, we did have a scene in the film where Anita said, look, if I could be born again, I'd like to be born in the Midwest of America, because there's so much water, is what she said. And that I thought was very powerful, because there are lots of reasons, and she saw many of them, why the Midwest of the United States would be toxic to, and is toxic to, people of color, and is hard to survive in as a small and sustainable farmer, as Anita is. But nonetheless, the lure of water and the bounty of it there, draining though it is, I think was important for her to note. But when she went back home, it wasn't that she was like, oh, America's so great and Malawi's so bad. She was, as you saw in the film, sad for America. Obviously not for everyone. And I think that was one of the things about inequality that she registered about the United States, was that there's plenty of it here, that particularly along lines of race, there are deep schisms in the United States, and also that there were some people in the United States who kind of got it, right, and who see sustainable farming systems as vital to the survival not only of the United States, but of the communities in which those farms find themselves, particularly the Detroit communities, are the ones where Anita and Esther resonated very strongly. But when they got back to Malawi, they were just like, yeah, but they observed that there are a lot of Americans who don't understand, how lucky they have it, but also don't understand that luck's about to run out. And you saw that on the plane on the way home, where she said, look, as human beings, they should know that nothing lasts forever. And here in the United States, in the past year, 1 in 3 Americans was affected by climate change in one way or another, where they live. And that, I think, is a lesson that's coming home to roost for Americans. And of course, the struggle here is not that climate change isn't affecting Americans, it's that the politics of understanding climate change are preventing the kinds of action that are drastic and that are required. And I think for that, Anita has nothing but sadness for the United States.
Right. David is asking you, why did you decide to make the film? And there are quite a number of questions about the making of the films, how many hours of recording, how did you choose certain scenes rather than others? I mean, people are very interested, if you wish, with the documentation that went, and you said it's a 10-year in the making film, so obviously it must have been so fascinating to make. And any highlights you would like to share with us on this?
Thank you for those many questions. I mean, the big idea here was like in 2010, if you remember back then, the kinds of films that were being shown about the food system invariably had communities of people of color. The film would open up and you would see people of color waking up in the morning, and the lights would, the sun would gradually rise, and that those people of color would be suffering in one way or another, and they would be victims. And then, the depth of that suffering would be mined, and you would see yet more suffering. And then there would be an expert who would come on, me or Vandana Shiva or someone else, and we would say, oh yes, this is very bad because Monsanto or the food system, capitalism, it's all grinding people down. And then you'd have a pivot in the film, and all of a sudden you'd hear this sort of jangly guitar music, and you'd see white people at farmers markets buying kale. And the end of the film would be, look, if only we buy kale at the farmers market, if only we shop organic at Walmart, everything's going to be fine. Now, I was very angry with those films, and I was frustrated to be in those films and having recorded ideas that were far more radical than the ones I ended up in the film. I was frustrated that in the end, the suffering of people of color sort of disappeared, and at the end, it's just white people in farmers markets. So the reason to make this film was to show through storytelling not only that frontline communities are intelligent and capable of understanding and theorizing why they're in the situations they're in, but then also innovating their ways out of it, like with the climate change stove, for example, which is an idea that sort of circulates in a number of places. But Anita, I think, saw it in a market in Lilongwe and came back with that idea, and they improvised their own version. But it's not just improvising with technology like like these stoves. It's also improvising with technology like gender equality, which is an important technology, and it's important to understand it as a technology. It's the best technology we have for ending hunger. So these kinds of ideas were really central to why we wanted to tell this story. The idea of gender equality was central. We knew right from the start that this was going to be an important thing. But the telling of the story was something I had zero experience in. So I was lucky enough to be accompanied in that our first shoot there. I mean, I've been working with soils, food, and healthy communities for a little while, but in 2011, I was accompanied by a guy called Steve James. Steve directed a monumentally important film called Hoop Dreams. It's one of the best American documentaries of the history of documentaries. And Steve was just sort of filming our introduction to the village. And I was standing up at the front saying, hello, we're from the left, and we're, from America, we're going to tell your story. And the important people in the village stood up and said, yes, we're going to tell our story. It's very exciting that you're telling your story. And then at the back, there were 3 women who were sassing everybody, who were throwing shade, and they were back chatting. And Steve's camera kind of turned to them. And Steve said, look, one of those 3 women is going to be the one who is going to help tell this story, because she's not a true believer. She's got her own mind. She's strong-willed. She's independent. And one of those 3 women was Anita Chitaya. And it was clear that actually, in the course of the 10 years, what emerged was that this was not my story to tell. It was mine to enable. And so, initially, as we were putting this film together, I was doing some scratch voiceover, but it was the worst kind of sort of David Attenborough style. And here we are in Malawi with Malawi. They're doing tremendous things. They're very innovative, and if you listen very quietly, you can see them innovate around climate change. And so all of that was just it doesn't work. But when you hear Anita tell what's important to her, that changes the cadence of the film entirely. And so you've got scenes in the film that were Anita's, and she insisted that were in the film, like the marriage abduction discussion, was something that she said 3 or 4 times very clearly until she was frustrated with us asking. It has to be in the film. So this kind of approach shifted for us. It helped us realize how colonial we were in the filmmaking, but also helped us realize that it's possible to decolonize filmmaking. And in the same way that we're having all these discussions about decolonizing farming, we can decolonize the storytelling about sustainable agriculture. And so that's the film that we've got here, is 10 years, hundreds of hours of footage that we, in the end, realized, look, Anita has to be the narrator. And so she co-created the narration with us with a very long process in Malawi. And that's how we ended up 10 years later with this film.
That's wonderful. I think you answered a lot of the questions. You're very talented, Raj. I don't have to put them to you then. But there is one question that you haven't quite addressed, which has to do you know of any action, of concrete action that came out of making the film? Because you're an activist. So the beauty, the aesthetics, the strength of your extraordinary storytelling in everything you do, you want it to have an impact on the world. So how do you think that happened with this film? Were there concrete actions taken either in the USA or in Malawi or even elsewhere as a result of this film? Not just the watching by people, but perhaps through the making of it as well, and the process of getting people together to make that film.
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, I think there are a couple of things to note. First of all, actions don't happen just because media is made, right? You see behind me, Inflamed. We had a conversation about that yesterday. And I see a few friends from that discussion here today as well. But the action is not making the book. It's the kind of work that, for example, my co-author Rupa Maria is doing in the deep medicine circle, organizing around it. And that's important because, you make a film, you write a book, you do whatever it is, that stuff doesn't make change. What makes change is the organizing and the transformation that happens afterwards. And that doesn't happen for free. It happens in contexts where there's organizing already happening. So I observe that just to say, look, it's at some level, it's still early. This film's been out only 6 months and only in festivals, so it's not really had a very wide reach yet. But we're hoping that it will in 2022. But there have been a couple of things that have emerged from the process, as you rightly suggest, Laura, that there is. There have been some really interesting things in the process of making this film that I'm quite proud of. One is that when we fundraised to finish it, the deal we made with our wonderful donors at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was that we would also work with our friends in Detroit, who, where Anita and Esther had, the deepest kinds of connection, for them to make a film in response to this. And their filmmaking was not just about making media, it was about organizing. And so next year, you'll be able to see a film called Reclamation. It's only 20 minutes, but Reclamation is a story about how different parts of Detroit's food system have come together and how they respond to the things that Anita and Esther brought to their door, things like patriarchy and climate change, and these discussions around how to fight back against the predations of climate change. And more than that, coming out of that process is also a toolkit, a legal toolkit for communities to be able to hold the power to tell their own stories. You'll remember I began this discussion saying, look, here we are. We're going to, we're here from the left. We're here to tell your story. Now, there are documentary filmmakers who do a kind of smash and grab, right? They drive past a community that's struggling. They're like, oh, that's very interesting. We're going to take that story and run with it. And there's never accountability. The community is never empowered to be able to develop the skills to tell their own story or to see themselves reflected as they see themselves. And so what we've developed is also a legal toolkit that any community can use to decolonize filmmaking. And again, that'll be out next year. But that's actually quite useful, because if you believe, as I do, and as we've argued in the past with Inflamed and a range of other things, that the media is a way of carrying and continuing certain kinds of domination and oppression, then how do you break that? Well, you break that by becoming the media and by creating your own media and protecting yourself from the way that the media would try to steal your stories and repurpose them. So in terms of just the media process, we've got some good outcomes. In terms of transformations, well, you see in the film how Jordan, for example, the young man who initially doesn't think that climate change is real, by the end of the film, because of his encounter with Anita and Esther, says, look, people are undone by ignorance. People are destroyed by a lack of knowledge. And he himself is transformed through the process of that film. And of course, Winston began the film as an unreconstructed chauvinist, and is now one of many men like myself who's just going to be fighting the patriarchy within them for the rest of their lives, but is already much less of a chauvinist than he was at the beginning. These are transformations that we documented as part of the film and that are continuing. And Winston is now recruiting. Winston is now persuading other men, persuading his sons, persuading other men in the village that chauvinism is not the way to go. And I think that those things already are really important and things to lift up, to laud.
Thank you so much, Raj. I mean, there is one thing you said, which I was going to pick up again, and there were a few questions about it. It's about this idea of denial. I find it quite extraordinary, because in the film you show very well that moment where people discuss the difference between weather and climate, and how do you perceive things changing, and therefore how do you act in response to these changes? But there is a much deeper form of denial, which I think the question is about, which reminds me of a critique that John Gray did in a Guardian article some years ago of your own work, which he says he was criticizing you for trying to differentiate money and price from value. And he says theories of value that focus on curbing desire run up against the demand for self-realization, which is one of the strongest impulses in modern life. And the problem is that here at Oxford, among the academic community, I am faced constantly with this idea, which I find a deep form of denial, which is, well, human desire is to be rich, is to be materialistic. We don't care about the environment. We will find solution because we have that, that human desire for self-realization. And so how do you react to this? I mean, how do you think that your film can actually empower people to resist this form of, denial, which are much worse than climate denial, if you see what I mean?
No, I do, and thank you, Laura, for reminding me of that. I mean, this idea of self-realization, I think everyone wants that, and I recognize that, and I think it's tremendously important. The hard part is when that self-realization comes at other people's cost, or comes at the consequence of destroying the planet, or the consequence of domestic violence, a range of things, right? And that's why this film is so useful. This idea of denial is actually better than not denial, right? So remember, what we've got two white families in this film. One in which you see Jordan in particular in a mode of denial, and you see the other family who are welcome the family, our family in Iowa, sorry, in Nebraska, who are welcoming in Anita and Esther, and then say, we're very sorry. Where Trisha says, look, I'm very sorry. I just feel very bad about your lives. Now, pity is not something that you can work with as an activist. When there's pity, that's the end of the conversation. Pity is
as the Malawi lady says, the friend of Anita, She
That's
says
right.
there is no place for guilt either. Yes.
Exactly. That's no good. And unfortunately, at COP26, where we showed this film, pity was the sort of political mode where the rich countries felt very bad about the burden of the global South, but did nothing about it. They just felt bad. That was the thing that they did. The thing they did was feel quite bad about it. But denial is a friction that you can do something with. Let me draw from an experience here in Texas. For the longest time, Texas was in a deep denial. It was just normal in Texas for Texas to appear as a sort of frontier Lone Star state. But then people started pointing out that Texas is the state that fought twice for slavery. It fought Mexico to keep slavery, and then it fought, white people here fought Mexico to keep slavery, and then they fought the Union to keep slavery. And all of a sudden, the government here started getting a bit antsy about that. And all of a sudden, they say, "No, you can't teach that." And this is, this is not the sort of thing that we want to have our children believing about Texas. And that denial is actually progress. That denial is a friction that you can fight with, because what's worse. As a person of color, what's worse is the pity of white people rather than, if you just confront an out-and-out racist, you've got something to fight. Whereas if you've just got the gentle condescension of the royal family, just sort of the sort of blanket of white supremacy that exists in the United Kingdom, then there's no point at which you can grab, seize some lapels and start shaking. So with, I think there's something politically very important about denial, because it points to a moment of polarization from which you can get some work done. And so all of this is to say, I think that Anita and Esther are veterans of denial, right? They were people who, first of all, had to persuade people that AIDS was real. AIDS denialism was rampant in Malawi. Then they have to persuade men that patriarchy is real, and there's plenty of that around everywhere. And now they have to persuade folk that climate change is real. Denial is stuff that they've faced all their lives, and they fought back and they got it. But much harder to fight against is people who are just like, we don't give a shit. You're obviously mad. You're going so far against what's normal. There's no conversation to have here. So that's why I think that if we're interested in transformative politics, denial is a useful first step. Change doesn't end with denial, but it begins with it.
Fascinating. I love your answer. Thank you so much. We have someone called Arif Jamal who is asking a question that I wanted to ask as well about the role of religion in all of this, because it's quite clear that one of the points that they all have in common, beyond race and socioeconomic differences, ecosystem differences, all these kinds of contrasts and differences, is that there is a Christian faith very clearly for all of them, like a common language among all these people in Malawi and all these people in the United States. So what do you have to say about that? I mean, I'll read you actually Arif's question. Religion was an interesting point of contention in the film, with the American farmers assigning climate change to God's plans, whereas Anita and her companions saw themselves as custodians of God's creation. Do you have an explanation for this, of how religion and agriculture relate?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and thank you for observing that. I mean, yes, there is one religion divided by theology. I mean, you've got, what you see in a couple of places in the film is a discussion not of is gender, patriarchy okay, or is climate change real? You don't see those discussions. What you see is interpretations of scripture, right? What does Anita do when she's trying to persuade Winston? She doesn't go, "You're a male chauvinist pig." She goes, "Look, we both believe in the Bible. If you believe in the Bible, then in Genesis you'll observe that God created men and women as equal, and women are meant to be helpers. How can you let your helpers suffer with so much work?" And I mean, it's an interesting theological approach. I've never heard Genesis used as a tool for gender equality, but this is the way that the theology and her theological discussions go, right? She is a ninja when it comes to thinking about theology. And so when you've got folk in the United States who hold views about capitalism, about climate change, about Christianity that's so diametrically opposed to hers, she doesn't talk about your dogma around capitalism or around climate change is rubbish. Instead, she goes for the word, and she uses Christianity in some useful ways. And honestly, I mean, this is not something I have any experience in. This is something I learned from her and learned from comrades who are in the church here, and continuing to learn. I mean, one of the things we're doing with this film is working with evangelical communities here, and working with different faith-based communities to figure out how to use this film to bring people into the conversation around race and patriarchy and climate change and capitalism in the United States in ways that have been off limits in through other kinds of media and other kinds of approaches. But there's some very live discussions here in America and around the world about whether before you learn about Christianity, you actually learn about capitalism. And so, from the crib onwards, certain Americans are taught about certain modes of ownership and domination that mean that other bits of the Bible are off limits. Jesus and the moneylenders doesn't get taught as much as the prosperity gospel, whatever that is. So all of this is to say, look, these are live theological discussions, and it's a language that I don't know anything about, and that we would have missed completely had Anita not been in the driving seat here. She speaks in the language of prophets and is able to reach people who frankly are not like the majority of us at these farming conferences. And in sort of left political spaces, these kinds of theological discussions don't necessarily feature in grad schools and in the academy, but in the wider world, they're tremendously important. And again, this is not, I mean, this is to say, look, what would have happened if I'd been much more in the driving seat of this film would be, we wouldn't be having this discussion. It would be a much worse film. But because Anita brings that sensitivity, that's actually a far more, human sensitivity than not having a spiritual approach to agriculture and to farming and to climate and to relationships. Having her bring that means that she's able to reach more people in a way that I think can be very transformative. And I'm so grateful for her for doing that. And so grateful for the question to be able to talk about that.
Raj, we know what a beautiful storyteller you are, because a good storyteller is someone who can listen as well as tell stories, and you've demonstrated that. And we have a number of questions around the aesthetics of the film, but there is one in particular from Judith, which I find fascinating, around the title, Ants and Grasshopper. And why is it, I mean, how did that come about? And why did you make such a short, moment of the film about that beautiful metaphor, of the grasshopper and the ants? Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Oh, we had such trouble coming up with the title for this film. One of the best suggestions from my partner was Anita does all these things, and which is, I mean, honestly, I quite like that. But it's true that she does all these. I mean, she is a mother, she is a teacher, she is a farmer, she is an activist, she is a kicker of asses and a taker of names. But in the end, it felt right that the title come from something that Anita said in the film. And when we went through the transcript, the thing that really jumped out was her use of this metaphor of the ants and the grasshopper. And also because it's not the European story. This isn't Aesop's fable. This isn't about the grasshopper sitting idly in the summer while the ants do all the work. That's the Greek, that's one interpretation. But in Malawi, in the sort of physical world in which Anita sees ants and grasshoppers, it's about collaboration. It's about how the small can overcome the massive, how we can all work together to lift up this burden. And that seemed to be the right way to do this film, is to subvert what you think the ants and the grasshoppers is about. But again, never to bang you over the head with it. The aesthetic of the film was always, I mean, this film, as I say, we had hundreds of hours of footage. The rough cut was 2.5 hours long, and we brought it down to 74 minutes, because less is more with these things. The particular can contain the universal, but you don't want to stretch that out. And that's why we were excited that just in the short 74 minutes, you can hold the film up and lots of people see lots of different things. And one of the reasons why this film is, we think, going to be useful for organizing is because it's fairly short, and the only way that you get the most out of it is by having these kinds of forums afterwards where people just sit around and talk and then figure out, okay, well, we've talked a bit, now what are we going to do? And I think that's the conversation that I'm excited for everyone to have next.
Right. Some people want to know how you got to know Anita. How did you make the first contact with her, and whether you're still in touch with her?
Oh yeah. No. She's now managed to get a phone, which she didn't have before. And whenever she leaves Bua and goes to an area where there's cell signal, we WhatsApp from time to time. But as I say, I first met Anita when we started filming. But I'd known about soils, food, and healthy communities for many years before that. I was lucky enough to go to graduate school with Rachel Besner-Kerr, who's one of the co-founders. And then through her, when I was living in South Africa, I went up to Malawi and met Rachel and met Esther Lupavia and met the team there. So I've been working with them for years before starting filming. And so I only met Anita really when we started filming in 2011. But obviously we're a big part of each other's lives now, and hopefully will be for a long time to come.
I just want to mention at this stage a wonderful anthropologist who retired quite a while ago, but is one of the specialists of Malawi, Brian Morris. And he has written many books and articles on the ethnobiology of traditional farmers in Malawi. Even he has a book on insects and human life in Malawi. Mm. So I just wanted to bring him to Anita. I'm sure they would have brilliant conversations together. He wrote about medical botany, medical herbalism and divination, and also about kinship relations in Malawi, the importance of matrilineal and goddess figures, etc., etc. So it seems that, you know, the film to me illustrated some of the things I've learned from Brian. I've never been to Malawi, but I cannot think of Malawi without associating his name to this wonderful country.
Well, but it's also important. I mean, where Anita lives is not. I mean, is still a fairly patriarchal, not matrilineal area, and so. A lot of the work still there is to some extent against tradition. And again, in the film, you see Ed and Trisha holding tradition, fairly close to their hearts. And you see Anita as the sort of vanguard against tradition. Of course, that upends the standard narratives we have about sort of white saviors going off to Africa and preaching progress, when in fact often it's or it can be the other way around. But so I think context is everything here. And so while there are in Malawi certain important transformative models for fighting patriarchy, you'll also notice that Anita is Catholic, and there's a shot, a very brief one, of her in church with a white priest at the front, and she's the Catholic Church isn't everyone's immediate thought of what institution do you think of when you think about fighting patriarchy, but still all of this is to celebrate that yes, there's richness and diversity and contradiction everywhere, but you can learn to fight power in lots of different ways, and I'm excited as we move this conversation forward to think about the actual transformative work that's necessary now.
Apologies, I have my computer that needed recharging.
But unfortunately, I think we may be coming to the end of our time, because I need to go do my own reproductive labor and pick up my kids from school.
Right, thank you so much. And I really, really hope we will have many more conversations over the years. A lot of people have said, can you come to our festival? Can you show this film in this context, etc., etc.
Well, let me answer many of those questions by saying yes, and also just pointing you to the website of the film. I'm putting it in chat. If you click on that, we're sort of building out our outreach, and when the legal toolkit is out, we'll stick it there. We'll have links to reclamation when that happens, and we'll there's material there for at the moment just for churches, but we're building that out too. So just stay in touch, drop a line, but also do keep an eye out for the kinds of amazing work that Soils, Food and Healthy Communities are doing, because obviously none of this could happen without them, and that's a link to their website too. But thank you so much for joining in for these fantastic questions. Really grateful.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you to all of you.